Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Good evening. There's an echo. Somebody muted. Unmuted there.
I saw it.
Anyway, yeah, good to be here with you all. And as you know, the familiar, we're going through the book of Matthew, and we've reached chapter 18 tonight. So I'm just going to break down a few things as they relate to that chapter. And there's a few things that I've seen. Jesus, he starts by teaching really about humility. That's his first kind of point. And I'm going to kind of stop off at, and then have a little look around what he's saying about sin and wrongdoing and being wronged by other people. And then he goes on to end it with a parable about forgiveness, and actually also about unforgiveness as well. So those are the kind of 3 points that hopefully I'll get to if there's enough time. Oh, somebody was going to, it doesn't matter. So hopefully you've got your Bible and you can just follow along, because I'm not going to read the whole thing, but somebody was, but it's not happened, so it don't matter. So it starts, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So that's the opening line of chapter 18. And it doesn't say who asked the question. But the disciples here, they're kind of like barking up the wrong tree a little bit. They're asking the wrong question. It seems to me that they're coming from a really earthly perspective. And they're looking for who's going to be the top dog, the top man in the kingdom of heaven. That's like a really kind of worldly way of looking at it. And it sounds like they're a bit of there's some ambition going on. They're vying for a position amongst themselves. They've been with Jesus a while now, and perhaps there were some tensions are beginning to develop amongst them. And in chapter 17 last week, or the week before, whenever we did chapter 17, we saw about the transfiguration, and Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and went up the mountain with him. So I kind of wondered if they started to feel a bit superior, a bit special, if there was a problem with the other. How many would be left? 11? That they weren't. Perhaps they were feeling a bit put out. Maybe they felt a little threatened by the fact that they hadn't been invited, a little bit less than the other three. So, there's all this kind of stuff that seemed to be going on. And it's not the first time that the question or the only time they discussed this question. They talked about it in Luke 22. They argue about who was the greatest. And again, in Mark chapter 9, the same thing, arguing about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And even in Matthew 20, James and John's mother goes and talks to Jesus. I don't know if they send her or she just goes off on her own accord. But she said if either of her sons could sit next to him, one on his right hand and one on his left. So she's really sort of like getting my boy, trying to get them the better position. All this is kind of like really worldly and earthy thinking. And I think there's I sort of talk about humility, and there's a definite lack of humility in all of this, or at least an understanding of Jesus's point about the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So just a quick look at what is humility. And I've come up with it's to be free from pride, right? To have a lack of arrogance, to understand that you need to be free of your own sense of self-importance. Not to think less of yourself, but to think of yourself less. You've all heard that. And to know that you are not God, right? I heard an expression in AA years ago. I don't know if anybody's ever heard it. This guy said, when you know that you don't know, then you know. And that's quite a humble way of viewing the world. So there's this kind of self-centeredness going on, and we know in AA. I'm not sure about CA and NA and other things. My recovery brain is glued into the AA Big Book, and I know where things are in that. And I know, hopefully, you'll know that in that book it says selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problem. And it sounds very much to me like there's a whole lot of self-centeredness going on here amongst these 12. Anyway, so Jesus answered to this question. He said, he called a little child to him and he placed the child among them. And he said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And I was struck by the bit where it says, unless you change. In other versions, there's another word, unless you do something else. But in the NIV, it says, unless you change. And again, for us in recovery, that's a key thing. Being in recovery and getting sober and going through the motions of not using and not drinking, it's all about change. We have to change. He said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, never enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's a pertinent idea for us in recovery. And but the 12-step program, as I said, it's all about change. And you may have heard in our early days, we all hear things like, the only thing you don't have to change is your name. You can keep your name. Everything else about us needs to be addressed and looked at. And I heard in my very early days, I heard people say, the person I was drank and used. And if I don't want to drink and use, it's important that I don't stay the person I was. Change. So it's all about changing. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus often said, you've heard it said such and such, but I say such and such. Like, for instance, he said, you heard it said that you should love your neighbor. In the Sermon on the Mount, he goes on to say, but I say you should love your enemies. So there's this whole thing that he did, that Jesus does, and he turned people's thinking on its head. They were set in this way, and he was not forcing them, but he was teaching them how to change, how to see things differently, how to not be who we were, because we need to change to be in recovery. But that's what he was doing to them, because he's speaking to a Jewish audience on the Sermon on the Mount. But for me, it all seems to link in really nicely. So he does it. The idea that to be the first in the kingdom, you must become last. Like the little child, that was alien to the disciples. And he goes on to say, therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And in that bit on the internet, I found Bible ref. It says the greatest in the kingdom will be the one who humbles himself like this child. And the point is that not for Christians to be gullible or naive or stupid in any way. Rather, they need to look to God with a trusting faith, a faith trusting of a child, not to be childish, but to have that childlike trust in Jesus, with acceptance of our own. We need to accept our own limitations, know that we are very, very limited people, and God is limitless. And in verse 6, he says, if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone round their neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. So I've read a few commentaries about it, and I'm actually not sure here who he's really talking about when he says the little ones. Some people say he's still talking about children, and others say he's talking about people who are young in their faith, that people have only just come to know. So somewhere in amongst all of that is who he's talking about. I don't think it really matters. But for us, it's like, the equivalent to that is like newcomers, isn't it? It's like we need to be very aware that, recovery is full of newcomers coming in. Thank God. There's always new people coming in for us to be aware of. And he's saying there's this stark warning to anybody who messes with like the innocence of childhood, the innocence of a newcomer, and there's consequences. What he's saying is it's bad enough when we sin, but when we're responsible for provoking somebody else to sin who's not been around as long, and we've all seen it. It happens, and that's the kind of stuff that we need to be aware of. And we're walking a bad path when we do that. That's not really good. Anyway, he moves on to talk about how to avoid sinfulness. He says, if your hand or your feet causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. Better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. But I'm reckoning that the thing of cutting off hands and plucking out the idea, these are metaphors for what we need to do. I don't think he's really thinking we need to do that. Although I hear they do that, or used to do that in some cultures back in the day. If a thief was caught, they'd cut his hand off. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the kind of stuff that I've always heard about. But these are sort of like taken figuratively. And I was thinking, anyway, if you did cut a hand off, it wouldn't stop you stealing. Well, I don't know about anybody else, but it wouldn't stop me stealing if I wanted to steal, because I've got another hand. I just use the other one. So, and is it possible to cut both your hands off? How do you cut the other one off when you've only got one? So, so that's all to be taken figuratively. And the same with the eyes. It's the same. It's just to prevent you from potential. In most cases, certainly in my case, it's all about lust and looking and all that kind of wrong sort of stuff. So the lessons that we learn from this are lessons of the heart, really. That's what needs to be addressed and cut off. And even the most important things in our life, if they cause us to sin, they've got to be got rid of. We need to cut them off. They need to be laid aside. And we might have to part company with close friends, cut off relationships in order to compromise the sin. When I was a kid, me and this guy, we grew up, we were just tight buddies through our lives. He's dead now, died of the illness. John, his name was. John, I used to call him. And when I first tried to stop using, when I first got into recovery and was really trying to not, I was going to meetings, I was doing everything right. And then I'd meet up with him. And within seconds of being in his company, bang, I was on it again. There was something that just used to drag me back, and we were the closest of friends. And I had to pull away from it. I had to kind of really sacrifice a real relationship in order to help me stay sober. And I lived in London. I lived in Notting Hill. I lived in an area that I loved it. I mean, I loved where I lived with a passion. It was like, for me, it was the greatest area in London. And I had to come away. I had to pull up. In fact, it's a big part of why I ended up moving down here, was to get away and put myself in a place where those kind of things that were pulling and luring me weren't doing it. Sorry, I better keep that on so I know what the time is. Yeah, so that's kind of like what's going on here. And so it's worth any sacrifice that we need to make to avoid going back to our old lifestyles and the misery that always seems to bring all of us. If it didn't, we wouldn't be here. So then he goes on to the parable of the lost sheep. And in it, Jesus explains what he is doing for people, especially when they feel left out, or when you make a mistake, or you mess up badly. You've been lost or excluded. You're that one sheep. And in the parable, the sheep has a flock of 100. And he leaves 99 of these good sheep, these sheep that are all in good shape. They're doing great. They're up on the mountain. They're eating the grass. They're doing what good sheep do. And he knows they're all right. And he goes off to find one who's messed up and gone astray. So again, it's about people who are in relationship with the Father. It says, you know, in this case, there's 100 of them. And he's showing that like this shepherd who leaves the sheep who are safe and doing okay, and he will go and get the lost one, as I said. He looks out for the one who needs him most at that time, the sinner, the lost one. He gives them mercy and brings them back into the family. An interesting thing, or I think it's the interesting thing, we are all lost sheep at certain times. We're all sin. The Bible says we're all like sheep who have gone astray. We all mess up, and we all need Christ to come and give us his mercy and his grace and his loving kindness to bring us back to him. And sometimes I look at this parable and I think myself as one of the 99. I don't tend to think of myself as one of the lost one, but I saw something when I was looking at it, and it said, when you do that, you're missing the point of the story. You're missing the point. And for us in recovery, I always see a parallel for us in recovery. And this is like someone who's relapsed, somebody who we know and we love, and we've been in fellowship with them for a long time, and they've been doing well. Maybe they're 10 years sober. Who knows? It could be anything. And something happens, and they leave, and they go off and they start using. And this is like the lost sheep. This is for me the recovery equivalent of this lost sheep. And maybe his or her sponsor will go and have a word and try and bring him back, or the Lord himself will go out of their way to bring him back. And we'll go, hey, great, he's back or she's back. You know, it's great to see somebody come back in and begin to do well again and get their lives together. And this is kind of like the message of this this parable for me. And funny enough, I'll just say I used to live in Spain at one time, and I lived down on the coast, on the south coast of the Costa del Sol. Did all that sort of like coastal life with Marbella and various places up and down the coast of Fuengirola. And we were fed up with it. I went to move up into the mountains. I went and lived up in this beautiful, beautiful Christian retreat house up in the mountains in Andalusia, just on what they used to call the campo, out in the country. And you could see goat herds and shepherds. They would be wandering about with these flocks of sheep and goats and things like that. And then one day I was going, and I actually saw this. It was a goat, it wasn't a sheep, but it was a goat, and it fallen into a ditch at the side of the road. And there was a picture very similar somebody was sharing a couple of weeks ago, but this was actually there in front of me, and it was bleeding. It was like off its head, the poor thing, with fear. And I didn't know what to do. I was with somebody, and we decided what we would do was just leave it. And then sometime later, the goat herd literally came along, did exactly what this shepherd had done, left his other goats, came along, found his goat, pulled it out of the ditch, and took it home. And it was just a lovely kind of thing for me to remember that I'd seen that happen, and then have a look at this. So I just thought I'd share that with you anyway. So anyway, I'm going to the next section, 15, that looks into the sin in the church and how to deal with it. But what it does is it continues the theme of sin and forgiveness. But I'm going to jump to verse 21, because it all leads to Peter asking the question, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times, he says. So what we have to do, it's important that we understand the context of the time, because apparently it was common teaching that a Jew should forgive sin 3 times. This was the standard thing that was taught in the Torah. You forgive 3 times. So Peter is probably feeling all kind of like super generous. Doesn't say 3 times, 7 times, you know, really sort of like going for it, as he often does, Peter, doesn't he? And So that was the thing. After three strikes and you're out, kind of thing, was really it. And so Jesus says, not for the first time, as we saw earlier, he's about to up the ante again. He changes thinking. He addresses the way people are thinking again, and he changes it up again, and he answers, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. In another version, it says 70 times 7, which apparently is 490. So that's a lot of it's a lot of forgiving, a lot of time of forgiving. So, but I think he's making the point that we need to continue forgiveness as a way of life, really, and not harboring resentment, not letting loads of anger build up in our minds. Again, in a big book, we hear resentment, the number one offender. From it stem all sorts of spiritual disease. And believe me, I know that it's easier to say all this and to do it, but my experience has shown with the word of God and the teachings of Jesus and working the 12-step program, I no longer live in a state of anger. I was very angry at one time. Mix me with alcohol on a bad day, and it wasn't a pretty sight. It was a very, very angry person that used to come. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Horrible, horrible. But so I can still slip into anger. I can still have anger rise up in me, but it doesn't consume me in a way that it used to. I'm not completely free, but I'm well on the way, because because of what I do, I'm constantly being transformed by the renewing of my mind. Anyway, so quickly, just to move on to the thing of forgiveness, the next parable, how much time have I got? The next parable, the unforgiving servant. So the story opens up with these two characters, a king and a servant. And one day the king decides that it's time to reclaim some debts. This servant owes him some stuff, some money. And it's bad news for this servant, because it says that he owed the king 10,000 bags of gold. That's a lot. That's a lot, right? That's like owing millions and millions of pounds to the guy. And, he's completely unable to pay it back. So it says that to help to recoup the loss, the king demands that the servant sell his wife and kids. She must have been worth quite a bit of money, or the children were, but it still would never have been enough. So he falls to his knees, the servant, and he begs, be patient with me and I will pay you back everything. But incredibly, the king says he took pity on him and cancels the debt and lets him go, which is pretty amazing. So you can imagine how relieved he must have felt. He's on a winner here, big winner, sense of freedom that would have come from it. And then he walks out and he meets another guy, another servant that he works with, who owes him money. And he begins to choke. He goes over and grabs hold of him and chokes him and says, look, I want my money. You pay me back. You completely forgot what's just been given to him. And of course, he can't afford it either. And instead of showing compassion like he'd just been showed, he gets the guy chucked in prison. And, and then the king hears about this and calls the servant back in, and he's not happy. He's not impressed at all, at this proper resentful servant. And he says, calls the servant in, and he says, you wicked servant, I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? In his anger, the king hands him to the jailers to be tortured until all his debt is repaid. So it's all come back on top for him. He's probably kind of in a great state of fear. And though he experienced huge forgiveness, it didn't change his heart. He didn't have a heart experience about this. He just saw it as perhaps something that the king should have done. But Jesus ends with a warning of how my heavenly Father, he says, will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So it's a bit of an ominous warning, and it's just saying that, you know, forgiveness of others is for us, really. You know, we are the one. You know, it's that thing of drinking poison and expecting somebody else to die. When we're full of unforgiveness, the person who's really being hurt is us, is you. So, having looked at that parable and break it down really into practical lessons that we can apply to our lives today, I found some stuff on the internet, these 4 points. He says, we cannot repay our own debt. So the servant in this story, he's racked up all this debt, and there's no way he could ever pay it, because the debt because of that debt, he was destined to this life of misery in jail. And similarly, each of us has an insurmountable debt or sin, according to Romans 3. The consequence of this sin, this debt, is eternal separation from God. And we're incapable of repaying our debt. We cannot do it without the action from outside world source, and we have no hope. But God, on the back of the t-shirts, on the back of last year's Believers in Recovery, he said, but God. And God offers us an unreserved and an undeserved forgiveness. It does for us what we're incapable of doing for ourselves. And we shouldn't miss really the significance of this. We don't deserve forgiveness. We're not worthy of saving, really. We deserve death. But God gives us life instead. He gives us what we need and not what we deserve. And he's a good God, even when we're not. Third point, we can forgive because we are forgiven. Because of this forgiveness, we have been set free. Our debt, our sins have been forgiven. But this isn't just a get out of hell, get out of jail card. We've got something that we have to do. We're forgiven so that we forgive. We're freely given, we freely give. And just as we received undeserved forgiveness, we're called to do the same to other people. And our world is full of unforgiveness and people seeking payback. The results are everywhere. We see it around us everywhere. Brokenness, pain all around us. And forgiveness is the way out. And the fourth and last point, our love for God is shown in our treatment of those around us. We are able to forgive because we are forgiven. But it isn't just an ability, it's an expectation of followers of Jesus. Forgiveness should be one of the hallmarks of who we are as Christians. It should just be how we operate. Jesus took a sin on the cross as he did yours. He took mine, he took yours, and forgiveness is possible and freedom can be experienced. Your love for God is shown by how you forgive those around us. So one of our aspects of our love for God reflects in how we deal with other people. And this parable, the unforgiving servant, it teaches the importance of receiving the forgiveness of God, as I said, and extending to those who've wronged us. So that's what I learned from this parable as I studied it. So I hope that made sense. And there you go.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, you need to.